The discovery. The mansion stood at the edge of the town, a relic of a bygone era, its once grand facade now crumbling under the weight of time and neglect. The townsfolk spoke of it in hushed tones, as if the very mention of its name might summon some long-forgotten curse. It had been abandoned for decades, its halls silent, its rooms empty, save for the dust and the shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. But all that changed when a group of urban explorers decided to venture inside, armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure that outweighed their common sense. The group consisted of 5 friends: Emma, a photographer with an eye for the macabre; Jack, a history buff who loved nothing more than uncovering the secrets of the past; Sarah, a skeptic who didn't believe in ghosts or curses; Mike, a thrill-seeker who lived for the adrenaline rush; and Lucas, the quiet one, who always seemed to be observing more than he let on. They entered the mansion through a broken window, the glass crunching beneath their boots as they stepped into the dimly lit foyer. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and the floorboards creaked ominously under their weight. Emma immediately began snapping photos, the flash of her camera illuminating the faded wallpaper and the cobwebs that hung like curtains from the ceiling. "This place is incredible," Jack said, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "It's like stepping back in time." "Yeah, if time was a horror movie," Mike quipped, his flashlight sweeping across the room. "I half expect a ghost to jump out at us any second." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Ghosts aren't real, Mike. This is just an old, abandoned house. Nothing more." As they explored further, they came across a room that seemed to have been untouched by time. The furniture was still intact, covered in a thick layer of dust, and the walls were lined with bookshelves filled with ancient tomes. But what caught their attention was the clock. It was a massive grandfather clock, standing at least 8 feet tall, its dark wood polished to a mirror-like sheen despite the years of neglect. The face of the clock was ornate, with intricate carvings of what appeared to be celestial bodies, stars, planets, and moons, all orbiting around the central dial. But what was most striking was the time it displayed. The clock was counting down. The hands of the clock were moving in reverse, ticking backward with a steady, rhythmic precision. The group gathered around it, their flashlights trained on the face of the clock, as if trying to make sense of what they were seeing. "That's not possible," Sarah said, her skepticism wavering for the first time. "Clocks don't just count down on their own." "Maybe it's broken," Mike suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe it's a prank," Lucas said quietly, his eyes fixed on the clock. "Someone could have set it up to freak us out." Emma snapped a few photos of the clock, the flash illuminating the room in brief bursts of light. "Whatever it is, it's creepy. I don't like it." Jack, however, was fascinated. He stepped closer to the clock, examining the carvings on its face. "This is incredible. These symbols, they're not just decorative. They're astronomical. See? This one here is Saturn, and this one is Jupiter. And look at this is the moon, but it's in the wrong phase. It's like the clock is tracking the positions of the planets. But backward. What does that mean?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with unease. "I don't know," Jack admitted, "but I think we should find out." The group spent the next few hours exploring the rest of the mansion, but they found nothing else of interest. The clock was the only thing that stood out, the only thing that seemed out of place in the otherwise decrepit building. As they prepared to leave, Jack made a decision. "I'm going to come back tomorrow," he said. "I want to study that clock. There's something about it, something important." The others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one argued. They all felt it, even if they couldn't put it into words. The clock was more than just a curiosity. It was a mystery, one that seemed to pulse with a strange, almost malevolent energy. As they left the mansion, the clock continued to tick backward, its hands moving steadily toward an unknown destination. And somewhere, deep within the mansion, something stirred, as if awakened by their presence. The countdown had begun. For the scientist, Dr. Evelyn Carter was not a woman easily impressed. As a leading physicist specializing in temporal mechanics, she had seen her fair share of strange phenomena. But when Jack approached her with his findings from the abandoned mansion, even she had to admit that the clock was unlike anything she had ever encountered. Jack had spent the past week researching the clock, trying to make sense of its backward countdown and the strange astronomical symbols carved into its face. He had consulted historians, astronomers, and even a few occultists, but no one could provide a satisfactory explanation. Frustrated and increasingly obsessed, he had turned to Dr. Carter, hoping that her expertise in time-related phenomena might shed some light on the mystery. Dr. Carter agreed to meet with Jack at her lab, a state-of-the-art facility filled with cutting-edge technology and more than a few experimental devices that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. Jack brought with him the photos Emma had taken, as well as a detailed sketch of the clock's face and the symbols carved into it. "This is fascinating," Dr. Carter said as she examined the photos. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary, and these symbols, they're not just decorative, they're precise, almost mathematical." "That's what I thought," Jack said, eager to share his findings. "I've been trying to decode them, but I'm not getting anywhere. I was hoping you might be able to help." Dr. Carter nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "I'll need to see the clock in person. Can you take me to the mansion?" Jack hesitated. The mansion had an eerie quality that he couldn't quite shake, and he wasn't sure he wanted to go back. But the mystery of the clock was too compelling to ignore. "Yeah," he said finally, "I can take you there." The next day, Jack and Dr. Carter returned to the mansion, accompanied by Emma, who insisted on documenting their findings. The mansion was just as they had left it, silent and foreboding, with the clock standing in the center of the room like a sentinel. Dr. Carter approached the clock with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She ran her fingers over the carvings, feeling the intricate details beneath her touch. "This is incredible," she murmured. "The precision. It's almost as if the clock was designed to track something specific." "But what?" Jack asked. "I'm not sure," Dr. Carter admitted, "but I have a theory. The symbols on the clock correspond to celestial bodies, but they're not in their current positions. They're in the positions they were in, or will be in at a specific point in time. It's as if the clock is counting down to a particular astronomical event." "An event?" Emma asked, her camera poised to capture every moment. "What kind of event?" "I don't know," Dr. Carter said. "But if I'm right, this clock is more than just a timepiece. It's a predictor, a warning." As Dr. Carter continued to examine the clock, Jack noticed something he hadn't seen before. On the back of the clock, hidden beneath a layer of dust, was a small, almost imperceptible inscription. He wiped away the dust, revealing a series of numbers and letters that seemed to form some kind of code. "Dr. Carter, look at this," he said, pointing to the inscription. Dr. Carter leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied the code. This is a date," she said after a moment. "A specific date and time, but it's not in the past. It's in the future." "How far in the future?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with unease. Dr. Carter did a quick calculation in her head. 6 months. The clock is counting down to a date 6 months from now. The room fell silent as the weight of Dr. Carter's words sank in. The clock wasn't just a curiosity. It was a countdown to something big. "But what? We need to figure out what this means," Dr. Carter said, her voice firm. "If this clock is predicting an event, we need to know what it is. And more importantly, we need to know if we can stop it." As they left the mansion, the clock continued to tick backward, its hands moving steadily toward the date inscribed on its back. And as they drove back to the lab, none of them could shake the feeling that they were racing against time itself. The countdown had begun, and the clock was ticking. Disasters. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Dr. Carter and Jack worked tirelessly to decode the symbols on the clock, while Emma documented their progress and Mike and Lucas provided support wherever they could. But as they delved deeper into the mystery, strange things began to happen. It started with small, seemingly unrelated events. A minor earthquake in a region that had never experienced seismic activity before. A sudden, unexplained power outage that left an entire city in the dark. A freak storm that caused widespread flooding in an area that was usually dry. At first, no one connected these events to the clock. But as the disasters grew in frequency and intensity, it became impossible to ignore the pattern. "This can't be a coincidence," Dr. Carter said one evening, as she and Jack pored over the latest data. "These disasters, they're happening in a specific sequence, and each one corresponds to one of the symbols on the clock." Jack nodded, his face pale. "It's like the clock is predicting them." "But how? How can a clock predict natural disasters?" "I don't know," Dr. Carter admitted. "But I think the clock is more than just a predictor. I think it's connected to these events in some way, maybe even causing them." The idea was almost too much to comprehend. A clock that could cause natural disasters? It sounded like something out of a science fiction novel. But the evidence was hard to ignore. Each time the clock's hands moved closer to the date inscribed on its back, another disaster struck. And each disaster was more devastating than the last. As the death toll rose and the world began to take notice, Dr. Carter and her team found themselves under increasing pressure to find answers. Governments and scientific organizations from around the world reached out, offering resources and support. But even with their help, the mystery of the clock remained unsolved. "We're running out of time," Dr. Carter said one night, as she stared at the clock's face, now displayed on a large screen in her lab. "The countdown is accelerating, and if we don't figure out how to stop it..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what was at stake. The final tick of the clock was approaching, and with it, the possibility of a disaster unlike anything the world had ever seen. But as they worked to unravel the mystery, they began to notice something else. The disasters weren't just random acts of nature. They seemed to be targeting specific locations that were connected to the clock in some way. "It's like the clock is cleansing the earth," Jack said one day, as they reviewed the latest data, "getting rid of anything that might interfere with whatever it's counting down to." Dr. Carter nodded, her expression grim. "If that's true, then we're not just dealing with a clock. We're dealing with something far more powerful. Something that has the ability to reshape the world." The realization sent a chill through the room. The clock was no longer just a curiosity, or even a predictor of disasters. It was a force of nature, a harbinger of doom. And as the countdown continued, they knew that time was running out. The final tick of the clock was approaching, and with it, the end of the world as they knew it. Revelation. As the countdown entered its final weeks, the world was in chaos. The disasters had grown in scale and frequency, leaving entire regions devastated and millions dead. Governments were in disarray, unable to cope with the sheer magnitude of the destruction. And through it all, the clock continued to tick, its hands moving inexorably toward the date inscribed on its back. Dr. Carter and her team worked around the clock, desperate to find a way to stop the countdown. They had gathered every piece of information they could find, from ancient texts to cutting-edge scientific research, but nothing seemed to provide a solution. The clock was a mystery, a puzzle with no apparent solution. But then, one night, as Dr. Carter was reviewing the data, she had a breakthrough. "It's not just a clock," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "It's a key." Jack, who had been dozing in a chair nearby, jerked awake. "A key? To what?" "To another dimension," Dr. Carter said, her eyes wide with realization. "The symbols on the clock, they're not just tracking celestial bodies. They're tracking the alignment of dimensions. The clock is counting down to the moment when our dimension aligns with another one. And when that happens, the barriers between dimensions will break down," Jack finished, his voice filled with dread. "And whatever is on the other side will come through." The implications were staggering. The clock wasn't just counting down to a disaster. It was counting down to the end of the world as they knew it. And if they couldn't stop it, the consequences would be unimaginable. "We need to find a way to disrupt the alignment," Dr. Carter said, her mind racing. "If we can prevent the dimensions from aligning, we might be able to stop the countdown. But how?" The clock was a complex, almost sentient device, and they had no idea how it worked. They needed more information, more time. But time was the one thing they didn't have. As the countdown entered its final days, the team made a desperate decision. They would return to the mansion, to the source of the clock, and try to find a way to stop it. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. The mansion was even more foreboding than they remembered, its halls filled with an almost palpable sense of dread. The clock stood in the center of the room, its hands moving steadily toward the final tick. Dr. Carter approached it with a mixture of fear and determination, her mind focused on the task at hand. "We need to find a way to disrupt the clock's mechanism," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "If we can stop it from ticking, we might be able to prevent the alignment." But as they examined the clock, they realized that it was no ordinary device. Its mechanisms were unlike anything they had ever seen, a complex network of gears and levers that seemed to defy the laws of physics. And as they worked to dismantle it, they began to notice something strange. The clock was fighting back. Every time they tried to interfere with its mechanisms, the clock seemed to resist, its gears grinding and its hands moving faster, as if trying to outpace their efforts. It was as if the clock was alive, aware of their presence and determined to complete its countdown. "This isn't working," Jack said, his voice filled with frustration. "We're not going to be able to stop it like this." Dr. Carter nodded, her mind racing. "We need to think outside the box. If we can't stop the clock, maybe we can disrupt the alignment in another way." But how? The alignment was a cosmic event, one that was beyond their control. Or was it? As they stood there, staring at the clock, Dr. Carter had an idea. What if we create a counter-alignment? If we can create a disturbance in the dimensional fabric, we might be able to prevent the dimensions from aligning. It was a risky plan, one that could have catastrophic consequences if it failed. But it was the only plan they had. As the countdown entered its final hours, the team worked feverishly to set up the device that would create the counter-alignment. It was a complex, delicate process, and every second counted. But as they worked, they could feel the clock's presence, its malevolent energy growing stronger with each passing moment. And then, with just minutes to spare, they were ready. "This is it," Dr. Carter said, her voice filled with determination. "We have one shot at this. If this doesn't work..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what was at stake. As the final seconds ticked away, Dr. Carter activated the device, sending a powerful pulse of energy through the dimensional fabric. The room was filled with a blinding light, and the air seemed to vibrate with a strange, otherworldly energy. And then, with a final, deafening tick, the clock stopped. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, slowly, the clock's hands began to move forward, ticking away as if nothing had happened. The countdown was over. But as they stood there, relief washing over them, they realized that something was wrong. The air was still thick with that strange, otherworldly energy, and the room seemed to be shifting, as if the very fabric of reality was being stretched and pulled. And then, with a sudden, violent lurch, the world changed. The final tick of the clock had not stopped the alignment. It had completed it. And now, the barriers between dimensions were gone. The new world. The world was not the same. The final tick of the clock had not brought about the end of the world, but it had changed it in ways that no one could have predicted. The barriers between dimensions had been shattered, and the two worlds had merged into one. At first, the changes were subtle. The sky seemed different, the colors more vibrant, the air filled with a strange, almost electric energy. But as the days passed, the changes became more pronounced. Strange creatures began to appear, creatures that defied explanation, their forms shifting and changing as if they were not entirely of this world. The laws of physics seemed to bend and warp, creating landscapes that were both familiar and alien. Dr. Carter and her team were among the first to witness the changes. They had been in the mansion when the final tick occurred, and they had felt the world shift around them. When they emerged, they found themselves in a world that was both familiar and utterly foreign. What happened?" Jack asked, his voice trembling as he looked around at the strange, shifting landscape. "The alignment," Dr. Carter said, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and dread. It happened. The dimensions merged. The implications were staggering. The world they had known was gone, replaced by a new, hybrid reality. And as they ventured out into this new world, they realized that they were not alone. The creatures that had emerged from the other dimension were unlike anything they had ever seen. Some were beautiful, their forms shimmering with an otherworldly light. Others were terrifying, their shapes shifting and changing in ways that defied comprehension. But all of them were powerful, their presence altering the very fabric of reality. As the days turned into weeks, the world struggled to adapt to its new reality. Governments and organizations that had once been in control were now powerless, their authority rendered meaningless in the face of this new, chaotic world. People banded together in small communities, trying to survive in a world that no longer made sense. Dr. Carter and her team became leaders in this new world, using their knowledge and expertise to help others navigate the changes. They studied the new creatures, trying to understand their nature and their purpose. And they searched for a way to restore the world to its former state. But as they delved deeper into the mysteries of this new world, they began to realize that there might be no going back. The dimensions had merged, and the barriers between them were gone. The world they had known was lost, replaced by something new and unpredictable. And yet, amidst the chaos and the uncertainty, there was hope. The new world was filled with possibilities, with opportunities for growth and discovery. The creatures from the other dimension, while strange and sometimes terrifying, were not inherently malevolent. They were simply different, a part of a reality that was now intertwined with their own. As Dr. Carter stood on a hill overlooking the new landscape, she felt a sense of awe and wonder. The world had changed, but it was not the end. It was a new beginning, a chance to create something new and extraordinary. The clock had counted down to Doomsday, but it had not brought about the end. It had brought about a transformation, a merging of worlds that had created something entirely new. And as the sun set on this new world, casting its light over the strange, shifting landscape, Dr. Carter knew that the journey was just beginning. The final tick of the clock had changed the world forever. But it was not the end. It was the start of a new chapter, one filled with endless possibilities. And as the clock's hands began to move forward once more, ticking away the seconds of this new reality, Dr. Carter felt a sense of hope. The world had been reborn, and with it, the potential for a future that was brighter than anything they had ever known. The countdown was over, but the story was just beginning.